Did you know that the South African estates of Warwick and Kanonkorp in Stellenbosch both have Pinotage clones named after them? This happened because the Vittitech team of the time chose the genetic material from old Pinotage vines that were growing on both of these estates. Now, Vittitech chose these vines because they exhibited what they felt were all the characteristics of what Pinotage should be. It's best not to get too philosophical and think too much about all the power that sat in that one little decision, because it can get a little uncomfortable. But aside from the sensory characteristics that it was supposed to display, these vines also needed to be completely disease-free, and they had to show moderate vine vigor or vine growth and moderate bunch sizes, because Pinotage sometimes can be a little bit too much like its mother, Cinsault, and dramatically overcrop, and in fact, it can become a truly unruly beastie in all manner of ways. Now, these clones were added to the Savis catalogue in 1996, but really, technicians and viticulturists are developing new clones all the time in South Africa in order to improve what we think Pinotage should be. We've also spoken before about how in France, the Ministry of Agriculture, NTAV, has approved clone 1186 for cultivation in France. According to Charles Visser, the cultivar specialist at Vittitech, 1186 is really just a name that they made up to give to South Africa's PI48 clone, which was developed by Vittitech themselves back in the early 1970s. Now, we're talking about Pinotage clones because today's HanDrinksSolo wine of the day is a Pinotage, the Snow Mountain Reserve Pinotage made by winemaker James McKenzie, who, ironically, given the conversation, has no idea what clones were planted in this vineyard, because when the vineyard was planted back in the early 1990s, clonal selection really wasn't a hot topic. The fruit for this wine comes from a vineyard planted in the early 90s in the hot, rather continental region of Wellington. But it should be noted that the vineyard is quite elevated. It sits at about 390 meters above sea level, which is right at the tippy top of Professor John Gladstone's Goldilocks zone for vine growth, which is apparently between 200 meters above sea level and 400 meters above sea level for a whole number of reasons. This elevation is also really important in particularly warm growing regions. First of all, because there is a rough rule of thumb that says every 100 meters that you increase above sea level is a rough reduction in average temperature of 1 degree Celsius. But altitude also implies an increase in diurnal range, the difference in temperature between day and night. And I've left a link to a video where I explain that in more detail about how diurnal range can change the way a vine grows, how grapes ripen, and therefore can influence wine quality. I chatted before about how Pinotage has currently got two dramatically different categories: the big, rich, ripe, blue fruit, 15% alcohol, loads of oak, icon-style, executive bank dinner type wine. And then on the other end, you've got the early harvest, whole bunch aromatic, sour cherry, raspberry, skinny, vegan type wine. But there is also the middle ground, which we've been discussing a lot recently, and that is wines that are restrained enough to still have some grace to them, but also ripe enough to still show depth and a complete expression of a cultivar like Pinotage. And today's Snow Mountain Reserve Pinotage is exactly one of those wines. When we get into the glass and give it a sniff, at first, there are plenty of those icon-style notes that you would think belong in the big 15% alcohol wine, in that there is some cedarwood, there's a little bit of vanilla, there's definitely lovely black currant notes and even a touch of plum. Then there's some sweeter, almost cola notes and fresher cherry fruit as well. Now, when we give it a sip, well, it's on the palate that really you see the wine leaning a little bit away from that icon style, because the weight on the palate is fairly moderate. But what really starts coming through nicely is some fresher, juicy berry elements. There is the black cherry that we smelt, but there's also a really interesting, quite light, almost raspberry-like seam of red berry acidity that kind of weaves through the sweeter black fruit. And when it comes to talking structure, well, there definitely are tannins in here. In fact, the tannins almost hint at Pinotage's potential to be a tannic monster. It's like a veiled threat. But when you consider actually the wine in the glass, the end result between fruit and tannins is supremely well balanced. And finally, there is a hint of tertiary notes setting in. There's a kind of stewed prune note in there, which is a beautiful mix of sweet and savory. And I think it adds delightful depth to the wine, unless, of course, you hate prunes. Okay, so that's all we have time for today. But if you enjoyed the video, then consider supporting us on Patreon and subscribe to the HanDrinksSolo YouTube channel, where we put up at least 6 videos each month talking about things like wine science, wine history, unusual cultivars, clonal differences, and some of the dynamic winemaking styles that are coming out of the South African winelands.